Was it exciting? Did you have to make some calls?
There were a lot of calls made for a lot of songs in this movie. Honestly, like this movie, I think that like when you see it, it feels like a big, beautiful summer movie, but like we didn't have any budget. So there were a lot of favors and a lot of begging and
Your niece for Taylor?
I mean, honestly, she was with me on this experience the whole time, all throughout it. So like she really lived this with me. Yeah, she was, she's a person who shows up for you, and I'm so grateful to have that love and that support. But yeah, there were other people too that I had to call and beg, and people that said no. But I don't know what that means. So if somebody has a dictionary, I would love to find the definition of that. It's so confusing to me. No, we just begged to get a lot of the songs in the movie, songs that we couldn't afford, but people.
As the spotlight shone on the upcoming adaptation of It Ends With Us, what began as artistic tension behind the scenes quietly erupted into a scandal so tangled in tech, ambition, and betrayal, it threatens to reshape public perception of everyone involved. At the center of it all, Blake Lively, not just the actress anchoring the film, but an alleged orchestrator of a digital smear campaign that implicates names far beyond the movie's credits. What if the real drama wasn't the script on screen, but the one secretly playing out through hacked iClouds, weaponized screenshots, and an alleged abuse of influence for control over the film's narrative and edit? This is Sophia, and welcome to my channel, Smart Spill. In December, a peculiar packet began circulating quietly across media outlets, an unsolicited dossier from Blake Lively's camp. Inside, screenshots, supposedly explosive ones, purporting to outline her case against Justin Baldoni and the film's production narrative. But none of the screenshots were submitted to California's Department of Civil Rights, CRD. Why? Possibly because they didn't hold up under scrutiny, or worse, because they undermined the very claims she made publicly. Among those screenshots were messages allegedly dating back to May 2024, sent long before any formal complaint was lodged. These messages weren't officially tied to any legal motion, making their release to the Los Angeles Times and New York Times suspect at best and misleading at worst. The foundation of Lively's complaint hinges on the idea of a smear campaign, launched by Baldoni and others to sabotage her professional standing. But internal sources connected to Wayfarer Studios and even insiders close to Baldoni assert the opposite. There was no campaign, no sabotage, no retaliation, just a deepening conflict over creative control, exacerbated by behind-the-scenes tension and a battle over Final Cut authority. According to a timeline in private communications, Blake had locked onto the smear campaign angle from the beginning, weaponizing the term as a legal safeguard within a contractual retaliation clause. Her team intended to claim defamation or discrimination if her creative demands weren't met. This tension escalated when Wayfarer's internal testing revealed that Baldoni's version of the film outperformed Lively's. After a May 13 audience test, Justin's version scored an impressive 94% approval with key demographics, females under 35, while Lively's version followed with a less compelling 82%. Despite a prior agreement to honor whichever version scored better, Lively allegedly shifted gears, threatening to withhold promotional participation and making subtle threats, including potentially invoking sexual harassment allegations to force compliance. That's when Baldoni and his team began meticulously documenting every interaction. One message from May 17 stands out. Jen Abel, Blake's former publicist, texted Baldoni, pointing out manipulative behavior from Ryan Reynolds, including blocking Justin on social media. She implied it was a strategic maneuver to pressure Justin into meeting Blake's demands. Simultaneously, Jen proposed compiling a timeline of set incidents, witness testimonials, and internal communications that could be used to defend against what they saw as looming false accusations. Ryan Reynolds' public claim of being an uninvolved spouse contrasts sharply with his private involvement, as he seemingly used his own media leverage to shape public perception. But then came the digital breach that tore this entire narrative wide open. As litigation intensified, Jen Abel's legal team discovered something startling. Her personal iCloud was still linked to a company-owned phone, long after she'd severed ties with her former employer, Jones Works and its principal, Stephanie Jones. Abel's attorneys provided forensic evidence indicating that Stephanie had maintained unauthorized access to Jen's cloud account, monitoring her iMessages, collecting screenshots, and allegedly forwarding that information directly to Blake Lively. The implication? The screenshots released publicly were not merely cherry-picked. They were stolen. Evidence in the legal response includes inconsistencies between data extracted via forensics, using tools like Cellebrite, and ordinary iPhone screenshots. Most messages submitted through formal complaint were pulled via forensics, traceable, timestamped, and stored directly from the phone. But a handful were different. Screenshots with iOS tags like today 12:06 p.m., which could only have been captured in real time. One damning image, a text between Justin and Jen sent on August 5th, shows a timestamp consistent with an active cloud sync, yet Jen had her phone at the time. How then did Blake have that screenshot unless the cloud was being actively monitored? Even more damning is how those files appeared to match up with Jen's own photo logs, suggesting that not only were her messages surveilled, but her personal photo library was combed for ammunition. The legal filings now accuse Stephanie Jones of violating federal laws, including the Stored Communications Act and federal wiretap statutes. By staying connected to Jen's iCloud even after termination, she allegedly intercepted real-time communications, an action the courts have historically viewed as illegal surveillance. The defenses from Jones Works have been evasive. They argue the device was company-owned, as if that overrides the personal ownership of iCloud content. But federal law disagrees. Possession of a company phone does not equate to ownership of a former employee's personal cloud accounts, especially without a clear policy on data separation or consent. Stephanie's failure to immediately disconnect from the cloud after Abel's departure amounts to unauthorized access. More troubling is the suggestion that this access was never passive. It was exploited. Screenshots were passed along to Blake Lively, who then used them to frame a public and legal narrative that reinforced her claims of retaliation. However, many of these texts, when read in context, actually contradict her argument, suggesting instead a defensive scramble by Baldoni and his allies against growing media manipulation. Notably, Jen Abel's attorneys say the phone remained linked to Stephanie's systems until January, 5 months after her exit. Only when Jen changed her iCloud credentials did the intrusion stop, confirming the link. This prolonged access potentially gave Stephanie a mirror into every conversation, image, or file Jen touched across her devices. Even if Blake wasn't the one logging into the cloud, her acceptance and usage of the material, from unverified and allegedly hacked sources, implicates her ethically and possibly legally, depending on how this case unfolds. These are not speculative accusations. Abel's legal team asserts them as factual in federal court, not couched in hypotheticals or belief-based allegations. They're bringing receipts. And the story they tell isn't about a woman targeted by sexism, but a woman allegedly weaponizing that narrative for control and revenge. And then there's the matter of the press. On August 15th, Ryan Reynolds allegedly leaked a story to the Daily Mail, framing himself as the script's savior, claiming the film was failing until he stepped in to rewrite critical scenes. In response, Baldoni texted Jen and Melissa to strategize on flipping the narrative. Not to smear Blake, but to push back against Ryan's framing, which undermined the female writer and cast shadows over the creative team. Ironically, these messages were included in Blake's own exhibit leaks. And they don't show malice from Baldoni, only desperation to regain control of a story that was quickly spiraling out of their hands. The story, once thought to be about artistic conflict, now exposes a labyrinth of alleged deception, privacy violations, and reputational warfare that goes far beyond any film set. As the legal landscape shifted and discovery unearthed new layers of digital misconduct, the focus turned sharply toward the sophisticated manipulation that seemed to govern both the public narrative and internal strategy of Blake Lively and Stephanie Jones. No longer was this a simple case of conflicting edits or bruised egos. What emerged was a campaign of misrepresentation, calculated timing, and selective disclosures that painted a damning portrait of power leveraged unethically behind the scenes. The starkest example of this emerged not through courtroom drama, but through a pattern of discrepancies in the documentation Blake's team had been feeding to media outlets. Her early release of exhibits in December, long before the court filings, wasn't just premature. It was strategically done to seed the public discourse before her opposition had a chance to present rebuttals. But once the formal filings from Justin Baldoni, Jen Abel, and their attorneys surfaced, those early exhibits vanished from Blake's legal narrative. They weren't just excluded from CRD complaints. They were actively scrubbed from the version of events she would later claim under oath. Among these discarded elements were several text exchanges and images that directly contradicted the idea of a coordinated smear campaign. A particularly telling omission involved a full string of internal emails between Wayfair's legal advisors and PR representatives, showing them scrambling to respond to negative press that originated not from Baldoni's camp, but from Lively's own media allies. These exchanges revealed a reactive, not aggressive, media posture, teams trying to get ahead of a narrative already spiraling, not constructing one. Even more problematic was the apparent coordination between Stephanie Jones and outside PR firms tasked with shaping the coverage in Blake's favor. Jen Abel's attorneys submitted records suggesting that Jones had not only accessed Abel's personal communication, had compiled select screenshots and messages to share with third-party PR advisors. These advisors then used those snippets to pitch stories to high-profile entertainment reporters. Stories that matched up almost word for word with early coverage published in entertainment trade outlets in mid-August. These were not stories organically discovered by journalists. They were seeded. Behind the walls of court filings, a secondary battlefield was playing out across social media and gossip columns, where Blake's narrative of victimhood was reinforced by carefully curated leaks. Yet, at the same time, the full archive of forensically extracted messages told a much different story, one of escalating manipulation, coordinated silence, and quiet panic within Blake's camp as her version of events unraveled. What proved particularly indefensible was how Stephanie Jones and Blake handled questions of consent and disclosure. While they repeatedly asserted in motions and public statements that their access to the phone and data was legitimate, they simultaneously failed to provide any evidence of a written policy regarding personal cloud usage on company devices. In other words, they claimed the right to access data they never explicitly secured the right to access. And in the legal world, that distinction is not minor. It is fatal. In multiple sections of Jen Abel's amended counterclaim, her legal team methodically dismantled the premise that employer ownership of a device grants carte blanche access to an individual's personal data. The arguments were fortified by citing federal precedents where cloud-based communications, even when accessed through work-owned devices, were found to be protected under privacy statutes if no opt-in consent policy existed. Stephanie's failure to establish or enforce such a policy rendered all her access unauthorized. There was no gray area. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the entire ordeal was how long that unauthorized access continued. Abel's team made clear, the phone remained linked to her iCloud well into litigation. This wasn't a passive oversight. This was ongoing, conscious surveillance. Every time Jen sent a message or opened an app synced to her iCloud, it was duplicating somewhere else, on a phone in the hands of the woman orchestrating her professional undoing. When the breach was finally discovered, it wasn't through technical forensics, but through a simple act of changing her Apple ID password. That one change kicked Stephanie off the network, confirming what until then had only been suspected. Suddenly, no more mysterious screenshots, no more leaks matching private texts. The digital echo chamber that had served Blake and Stephanie so effectively went silent. But the legal fallout had already begun. By reclassifying the claims under federal statutes, Jen Abel's attorneys ensured that jurisdictional arguments, whether this should be a New York or California case, were neutralized. Federal law now governed the complaint, and with it came a stricter and more clearly defined set of privacy protections. The amended filings no longer focused merely on the unethical behavior. They alleged criminality, unauthorized interception of communication, theft of digital property, and coordinated defamation. And what of Blake? Her role in this saga, once framed as that of a creatively oppressed actress, now looked more like that of an opportunistic enabler, if not a direct participant. She had, by her own team's admission, received and utilized data never verified or authenticated through legal discovery. She had made statements to the media based on screenshots her legal team couldn't or wouldn't attach to formal filings. She had distributed exhibits with selective timestamps, out-of-context excerpts, and falsified sequencing, all meant to give the impression of wrongdoing that the full record simply didn't support. This manipulation didn't just affect Baldoni's reputation. It inflicted lasting harm on Jen Abel, whose professional standing in PR was decimated overnight. Clients abandoned her. Contracts disappeared, all because of a whisper campaign rooted in information gathered without consent and packaged to look like fact. The evidence didn't just refute Blake's claims. It called into question the ethical foundation of her entire legal strategy. What remains now is a case that may not just determine who gets final cut on a film, but who crossed the line into digital malfeasance. The true question isn't whether a smear campaign occurred, but who actually launched it, and whether the quest for creative control led Blake Lively and Stephanie Jones into territory from which they can no longer legally or reputationally return. In the end, the story of It Ends With Us became far less about fiction than it did about truth, and how far some were allegedly willing to go to bend it. In the aftermath of the digital unraveling, the focus of the court, and now public scrutiny, pivoted toward the consequences: reputational, legal, and financial. Behind the heavy legal jargon and meticulously drafted filings, the emotional toll was evident. For Jen Abel, the fallout from being mischaracterized as part of a malicious cabal reached beyond her immediate career. She'd been painted as complicit in a supposed retaliatory crusade that never existed, while, in reality, she had been the target of surreptitious monitoring, her private data mined and repurposed to support a narrative she wasn't even aware was being constructed. Her counterclaims laid bare the extent of the intrusion, not just messages and images, but metadata, contact lists, internal documents, some of which were only discoverable through synchronized storage. Abel's attorneys submitted technical analyses detailing timestamps and IP login records that proved unauthorized logins occurred even after legal notice was served. This wasn't a brief lapse in judgment. It was sustained, deliberate, and well beyond what any civil dispute over intellectual property or creative control could justify. Behind closed doors, industry figures were reportedly stunned by the depth of the breach. This wasn't a petty leak to Page 6. These were classified communications that included legal strategies, client confidentiality details, and privileged personal exchanges. The fact that these materials ended up not only in Blake Lively's hands, but then disseminated to third parties and media organizations suggested a level of premeditation that made even those previously sympathetic to Blake reconsider. The legal implications also triggered concern among professional associations. Confidential communications from industry labor boards and talent unions began circulating quietly, examining whether the alleged violations in this case warranted broader reform around data governance in entertainment. If a high-profile publicist could have her cloud accessed post-employment without accountability, what protections did others have? The case, still pending, was already setting off ripple effects. From the court's perspective, one of the most problematic elements wasn't just the alleged surveillance, but the systemic attempt to pass off manipulated or incomplete evidence as legitimate. Several exhibits Blake's team had distributed to media were now demonstrably inconsistent with forensic records. In one instance, a message that had been shown as a standalone smoking gun in public forums was revealed in the full forensic extraction to be part of a longer exchange that changed the entire context. Key details had been removed, cropped, or resequenced. And because these exhibits were not submitted formally to the CRD or included in any legal filing, Blake avoided perjury, but not accountability. For legal observers, this omission spoke volumes. If Blake's case had been airtight, those messages would have been foundational to her complaint. Instead, they became ephemeral leaks, released to shape headlines, but never tied to a sworn legal position. It was storytelling, not strategy. And when challenged in federal court, The gaps in the narrative became chasms. Meanwhile, the team defending Justin Baldoni brought forward corroboration from unrelated third parties, including studio executives and editorial contractors, who described the increasingly combative and erratic behavior from Lively during post-production. Internal communications supported their claim that the root of the conflict was editorial dominance, not harassment, not discrimination. Sony, which had originally remained diplomatically silent, submitted a sworn declaration confirming that test audiences had favored Baldoni's cut and that Lively had been contractually bound to accept that outcome. The legal strength of their argument was matched by the precision with which they dismantled the claim that anything retaliatory had occurred. Even Taylor Swift, whose name had briefly surfaced in the background of this ordeal, was indirectly drawn into discovery. Emails referenced her music as part of a promotional tug-of-war, where Blake allegedly threatened to withhold participation in key marketing campaigns if she didn't get her way. While Swift's team had no formal stake in the litigation, the mere association with the tactics described in the filings was enough to spark quiet distancing from all parties involved. From a financial standpoint, the damage had already spread. Production on the film had stalled during the peak of the dispute, resulting in mounting overhead and delayed deliverables to the studio's distribution partners. Industry analysts now speculated that even if the film was completed and released, its reputation would follow it. The story of It Ends With Us had become inseparable from the saga surrounding it. What was once positioned as a career-defining project for Lively was now viewed by many as a cautionary tale of what happens when access to influence collides with unchecked ego and digital misconduct. Behind every step of the scandal was a startling irony. In trying to control the message, Blake and Stephanie had handed their opponents the most damning evidence. Every screenshot they shared outside of court undermined their credibility within it. Every contradiction between their public claims and private actions made their legal positions harder to sustain. And at the core of it all was the simplest of miscalculations. They believed no one would look closely enough. But someone did. With Jen Abel's legal team now pressing forward on statutory and common law claims, including federal violations of the Stored Communications Act and intentional infliction of emotional distress, the stakes were no longer just about who said what. They were about whether boundaries, both digital and ethical, had been so thoroughly violated that monetary compensation alone couldn't fix what had been broken. What began as a dispute over a film had metastasized into one of the most compelling legal and moral dilemmas to face Hollywood in years. The resolution remains uncertain, but the truth, long buried beneath a pile of curated screenshots and shadowy press briefings, had finally begun to surface. And with it came the uncomfortable realization that some of the industry's most respected names may have stepped too far in the pursuit of power, right into the realm of illegality.